So that's how DRS functions here. This is how we create a cluster. I mean, that's all there is to it. Once you do create that cluster, you can go back and actually edit the settings of the cluster to see a little bit more details about what we did. This we've seen before. All of this we've seen before. There are some advanced options here. There's nothing really to talk about. I mentioned the VM restart policy. Okay, and I told you that I set the default here to low. Well, let's assume that my VM6 is a high priority VM now, because I've reduced the number of resources I'm protecting. Well, I know that VM6 is going to be one of the first VMs to move if I lose one of those hosts. So this is the final piece of that original conversation about setting up HA, protecting as much of it as my dollars can afford, and then setting the restart policy on those VMs so that I'm restarting the VMs based in order by the business rules. Right? So I know that VM6 is really important in my business, so do it first, and then do the app here as a medium setting, and then VM1 as a low setting, because I don't really care about that. And same thing with host isolation response. Maybe this one's important, so leave it powered on, but this one's not important, so power it off. You want to keep an eye on this as your virtual machines, as you start adding virtual machines. Do you want to turn on the VM monitoring or application monitoring for your VMs? You see here we get a little bit more stuff here that we can adjust on a VM setting. I also talked about how HA has a little bit better of a configuration, an architecture, as it relates to host isolation. So let me go back to my picture here for just a second. So here's my picture, and I have an isolation problem, right? Let's look at this one, for example. Maybe instead of this server failed, this server actually got isolated from the rest of the servers. Its management network is disconnected. Its virtual machines are still running, but its management connection is disconnected. So vCenter can't talk to the ESX machine, but the VMs are still running. It's just lost its management connection somewhere. That's what an isolation response is. In version 4 and before, this is a really bad day. Right? An isolation response meant powering down the VM, sometimes forcibly, so that we could release the VMFS locks on them down here in the shared storage, and they could be HA migrated over to a new host. Okay, bad day. And this could happen if somebody unplugs a cable, right? Or somebody hiccups the management network. This could happen. So what VMware did in version 5 is they created a secondary sort of backup channel. That backup channel uses a data store as the mechanism, and it's called a heartbeat data store. Okay, the heartbeat data store is only used in the case where you end up losing the management network connection, and I need to just keep the cluster contiguous enough, integral enough, so that I know that I can continue to talk to those other members of the cluster. Now, I can select any of the cluster data stores, taking into account preferences, so I would prefer one or the other, or I can select any cluster data stores or from preferred data stores here. Generally, you might just leave this to itself. It will choose a data store of the ones that are available that it thinks is best. The one thing you got to be careful of, the heartbeat data store works the best when the data store that is selected is available to every host in the cluster. Now, most people configure a cluster so that every data store can be talked to, can be communicated with every host, but not always. So if you do have data stores that not every cluster member can talk to, don't use that as your heartbeat data store. One little piece of advice there. That's HA. On the DRS side, we've seen the automation level here. I can also set up groups. Okay, this makes more sense if I take a look here at rules. These are what we call affinity rules. And in my affinity rules, I have the option of selecting whether I want to keep the virtual machines together or separate them out when I'm going through doing my load balancing. Now, think about how this might work, right? So I've got load balancing. I've got virtual machines that are moving around, right? Maybe they're my two domain controllers, right? They're moving around, so they're load balancing across all those different hosts. Well, if they're domain controllers, it's not a good idea for them ever to land on the same host, because if that host fails, I've lost my domain. So setting up a separate virtual machines rule would allow me to choose which VMs would always be segregated onto different hosts. Two domain controllers. Great idea. Separate them.